Hey everybody, hope that you're well. It's a beautiful day here on Saturday, so I hope you're at least enjoying the weather. I wanted to offer something a little bit different and something that I would feel quite remiss if I just dropped from the course, and that is some discussion of medieval Islamic thought. Why why offer a little excursus, a little detour on this topic? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, because of our almost exclusive focus on Christian medieval theology and philosophy to a lesser extent, that might suggest that in the Middle Ages, Christians sort of had a monopoly on these sorts of things, and that Christianity was the only religion sustaining a really lively discourse in theology and philosophy. That is simply not the case. Some of the most distinguished and influential philosophers of the medieval era were Muslims. In fact, there's a couple of thinkers that I'll briefly talk about today that people have argued are greater philosophers even than folks like Aquinas. And not only are these Muslim philosophers impressive in their own right, but they both exerted quite a lot of influence on Christian thinkers, and I'll touch on that at least. Now, conversely, another reason to look at this particular facet of the Middle Ages is because the influence could also work in a different direction. And Christians actually played a very instrumental role in the formation of Islamic philosophical thought to begin with. So I'll touch on that as well. So that's one reason. One reason is simply to avoid giving the impression that Christianity was the only real sort of theological and philosophical game in town in the Middle Ages. Um, the second reason is because I think you'll note that some of the development, some of the patterns, some of the dynamics of medieval Islamic thought parallel or mirror some of the same features, patterns, and dynamics that we have already seen and will continue to see in medieval Christian thought. For instance, in medieval Islam, you get a wide spectrum of attitudes, even among writers, a wide spectrum of attitudes about Greek philosophy and whether Greek philosophy is useful. You'll find some thinkers who are virtually rationalists, meaning that they believe that philosophy was sort of the master discourse that theology needed to serve. And on the other side of the spectrum, you find thinkers who are extremely suspicious and wary of philosophers. So you find that in medieval Christianity, and you find it in medieval Islam as well. You also can see, especially in those thinkers who are more of a have more of a rationalist bent, who really embrace philosophy and Greek philosophy. You see that sometimes those thinkers in Islam as well as in Christianity are tempted to or do in fact transgress the boundaries of orthodox theology. Now, one thing I wish that I had more time to talk about, and also wish I had more knowledge of, is the mystical tradition that Islam fosters in the first several centuries of its existence, a sort of aspect of Islam known as Sufism, S-U-F-I. And I'll just point out that Sufism is interesting because it's a mystical tradition that has often a rather suspicious attitude towards philosophy, but is not altogether hostile towards philosophy. There's a kind of complicated relationship there. And I point that out just because we can see this same dynamic playing out in medieval Christianity with people like Bernard of Clairvaux, very well educated, brilliant mind, but someone who is much more on the mystical rather than scholastic side of things, and therefore is a little leery of philosophy and of thinkers who seem to be overly seduced by it. So that's one of the reasons Bernard was so negative toward Peter Abelard, for instance. So uh, the point being that for all of its distinctive features, medieval Christianity is not utterly unique in some of the dynamics that we see, because we see a lot of them in Islam as well. Now, I'll be focusing more on Islamic philosophy rather than theology, because it's more the former, philosophy, than the latter, theology, that really interested some medieval Christian thinkers. The Muslim thinkers who tended to be more influential on Christians tended to think of themselves more as philosophers than as theologians, although they certainly had theological interest. But I am going to begin with Islamic theology, because it's really in the earliest forms of Islamic theology that one finds the earliest engagement of Muslims with philosophy. So that brings me to my first major heading, which is sort of the earliest uh, phase or instance of Islamic theology, known as Kalam, K-A-L-A-M. So Kalam is this sort of early era of Islamic theology. Um, so I'll just point out that, here Islam is very much like Christianity and Judaism, in that all three religions eventually foster a very robust tradition of philosophical thought, but not right away. Okay, so when these religions are sort of born into the world, they don't already have a kind of philosophical um, manifestation. Okay, that's going to come a little bit later. Um, and it's all another parallel between Christianity and Islam is that in Islam, as with Christianity, the earliest thinkers and writers to engage with philosophy were really theologians who had apologetic interest. And what I mean by that is that these were authors who were very interested in defending their religion, using philosophy to mount a defense, an apologia of their religion. If you've taken church history with me or studied early Christian theology, you will remember reading about the apologists, people like Justin Martyr, and that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of here. And we see a very similar development in early Islam with a group known as the Mutakallamun. I'll spell that out for you: Mutakallamun. Mutakallamun. These are the practitioners of Kalam, and as you can tell, the words are related. Kalam, by the way, is roughly equivalent to the Greek word logos. So it can mean something like word, thought, or reasoned discourse, something like that. Okay. So the Mutakallamun were like the Christian apologists of their day. And we don't really see the Mutakallamun emerge until the Abbasid period. The Abbasid is for the dynasty, is the second major Islamic dynasty after the Umayyad. The Abbasids established the city of Baghdad in modern day Iraq, and they make that their capital. And so it's not until the Abbasids are in power that we really see Kalam begin to develop. And the main goal of Kalam, of the practitioners of Kalam, the Mutakalamun, was to give a rational defense of the tenets of Islam. And in order to do so, they were willing to appeal to philosophy. They were willing to deploy certain philosophical ideas or concepts, not because they wanted to practice philosophy for its own sake, but for the sake largely of apologetics and polemics, attacking either Muslim groups they didn't like or attacking Christians or Jews or whatever. So they would appeal sometimes to Aristotle in order to stress the radical oneness of God. Or they might cite Neoplatonic negative apophatic theology in order to really stress God's transcendence, which they thought, Christians, for example, did not do adequately. And what I just said actually illustrates an important feature of Islamic philosophy really for the next several hundred years, and that is eclecticism. Okay? What I mean by that is first theologians and then later philosophers are going to be willing to engage with a wide range of Greek philosophy in order to advance their goals, rather than attempt to be purely Platonic or purely Aristotelian or something like that. Now, again, at this early phase with the Mutakalamun, what you get is generally not a deep, extensive engagement with philosophical text, but a pretty superficial and selective engagement with philosophical text, which again is true of some of those early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr. Now, let me mention one particular group of practitioners of Kalam, a group known as the Mutazilites, M-U apostrophe T-A-Z-I-L-I-T-E-S, Mutazilites. Now, the Mutazilites were very serious, zealous Muslims, but they had a kind of rationalist streak. I mean, they really did believe that the claims of reason and the claims of Islam were basically totally coextensive. So you never have to disregard reason or go against reason. Reason is always going to lead you to the right conclusions. Now, this ends up leading them to some controversial views, some views that not all Muslims subscribe to. I'll just mention two examples. One, in order to defend divine justice, the idea that God is just, the Mutazilites strongly asserted the freedom of the human will, what we would just call free will. Okay, now, some of you know that there are some Muslims who take a very strong sort of determinist approach, God has determined how everything is going to play out, all the way down to human actions. They didn't accept that. They believed that humans were truly free to choose the right or to choose the wrong. And they believed that was something that reason could demonstrate. They also believed that the Quran was not eternal, but something created. This was not necessarily a super fringy view, but it was a view that certainly not all Muslims agreed with. So that's just one example of what Kalam could sort of look like. Now, eventually, Islam is going to boast truly excellent, truly superlative philosophers in their own right. But something has to happen first. There is an intermediate development that must take place first. And this brings me to the next major point I want to talk about, which is Islamic translation projects. Okay. Now, a little bit of background before I start talking about the translations. I cannot stress enough just how moribund, just how inert Greek philosophy was during the early Middle Ages. Let's say from 500, 800, something like that. In the ancient world, philosophy was really seen as, excuse me, as Greek philosophy. Okay, so in the minds of most sort of ancient Mediterranean people, philosophy equals Greek philosophy, and this explains why even Roman Latin-speaking philosophers like Marcus Aurelius or Plotinus nevertheless wrote in Greek. Okay, but in the early Middle Ages, Greek philosophy was not even really copied, let alone actually written, in the Byzantine Empire from roughly the 7th to the 9th century. So in the very place you would expect that Greek philosophy might actually remain alive in some way, it is sort of frozen in amber. The situation in the Latin West is certainly no better. In fact, it's worse. Because, of course, the state of education in the Latin West in the early Middle Ages to begin with was not very good, and there were hardly any Western scholars who were proficient in Greek. So, very bad situation there. So the question is, who is keeping the Greek philosophical tradition, or at the very least, Greek philosophical texts alive in this period? Well, the answer is ironic, because the people who were keeping it alive were people who really lived in areas that were outside of or right on the fringes of sort of the Greco-Roman world. Because the people who were keeping Greek philosophy alive in the early Middle Ages are, largely speaking, Syriac-speaking Nestorian Christians in places like Mesopotamia and Persia. If you don't know about the Nestorians, don't worry about that. Just forget that part and just let's stick with Syriac-speaking Christians. If you do know about the Nestorians, then this is kind of an interesting wrinkle in the story. What these Syriac-speaking Christians did was to not only preserve Greek text, but actually translate a number of them into their own Syriac language. And they were particularly industrious when it came to the works of Aristotle and Neoplatonic writing. So writings not necessarily by Plato, but by the followers of Plato, who were writing in, around, say, 200 AD, so about 500 years after the time of Plato himself. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop. Once the Abbasids sort of establish their caliphate centered in Baghdad, a number of Abbasid caliphates actually patronize these translation projects, translating ancient Greek text either from the original Greek or from Syriac translations into the Arabic language. Okay, so let's just say this period of translation into Arabic spans roughly 200 years, something like 750 to 950. Okay, and again, they are working with these Arabic translators are working largely with texts that have been supplied by Nestorian Christians. And not only that, but some of the most distinguished translators were themselves Nestorian Christians. I'll just give you one name, Abu Bishr Matta. Abu, A-B-U, B-I-S-H-R, M-A-T-T-A. Okay. So these were Christians who were basically employed by the Islamic caliphs to undertake these translations into Arabic. And in the end, by the end of this period, virtually all sort of classic Greek works on science, on philosophy, on mathematics were translated into Arabic. Now, of course, this raises the question, why did the caliphs want this done, and why were some Muslims so enthusiastic about carrying out this project, where you're taking basically pagan literature and translating that into the language of the Quran? Well, I think for many, if not most of the translators, they weren't necessarily interested in philosophy per se. They were interested in some of the practical uses of these texts, text on medicine, text on math. They were interested in some of the political insights that these texts might yield. And when it comes to the philosophical text, again, I think many of the translators were driven by kind of apologetic and theological motivations. They thought that Greek philosophy could be useful in defending Islam and in explicating Muslim beliefs. Okay, so most of these patrons and most of these translators are not really concerned about philosophy with for its own sake, even though they're translating these works of philosophy into Arabic. This is going to change starting in the 9th century, and the big transitional figure here is Al-Kindi, so Alkindi, who lived from about 800 to about 870. Now, he's a Muslim thinker, although he was a pupil of Abu Bishr Mata, that Christian translator I just mentioned. Now, Al-Kindi was involved in a number of projects. For one thing, he was very much a part of this translation endeavor. So he commissioned numerous translations, mainly done by Christian translators, of Greek metaphysical works. So, Plato, Aristotle, Proclus, who was a Neoplatonist. But Al-Kindi was not just a patron of translations. He is really considered to be the first Muslim thinker to actually really do philosophy in the Arabic language. So that makes him pretty significant. So he initiates this tradition within Islam known as falsafa, Falsafa. If you look at that word, you hear that word, you might be able to figure out that it is in fact related to the Greek word philosophia. Okay, so it's a kind of Arabic transliteration of philosophy. So with Al-Kindi, and this is the third major point that I've made so far. I talked about Kalam, I've talked about the translators, and now I'm talking about Falsafa. Falsafa was understood as a kind of secular discipline in sharp distinction to Kalam, not necessarily in opposition to Kalam, but very strongly distinguished from it. That, when I call it a secular discipline, that doesn't mean that it's anti-religious at all, but that does imply some degree of independence from the strictures of religion. And as we'll see, this can sometimes get these Islamic philosophers into a little bit of trouble. But first, a little bit more about Al-Kindi, and then I'll mention a couple of other Islamic practitioners of Falsafa. So Al-Kindi's a 9th century figure, which means he's a contemporary of John Scotus Eriugena, if you want to sort of figure out where we are in time. He was from Mesopotamia. He was from what is modern-day Iraq, educated in Baghdad, and was a very ambitious, kind of wide-ranging thinker who believed that all knowledge was united and who believed that mathematics was actually the key to all knowledge. He believed that all problems, even the sort of the thorniest philosophical and theological problems, could be resolved without resorting to religious authority, without saying, well, go ask a teacher, or, go read the Quran or whatever. No, there's a kind of philosophical discourse, a kind of discourse of reason that can resolve all problems, that transcends religious barriers. Okay, so philosophy is a way of thinking, a critical, rigorous way of thinking that is based on reason rather than religious authority. Okay, so that's a big part of his legacy. But a couple of other things about his legacy are worth noting. He also demonstrated, arguably for the first time, that philosophy was an endeavor that need not be undertaken in the Greek language or in what would be considered the Greco-Roman world. So philosophy, he sort of claimed, at least implicitly, that philosophy could be a kind of transcultural international pursuit. Okay, which means that Muslims can engage with it with just as much credibility as anybody else. Um, and finally, again, he helped to establish a way of thinking about philosophy that gave it a certain independence from reason, from religion, rather, and who really believed that philosophy was capable of rationally explaining all reality, even what we would think of as religious realities. Now, as a good Muslim, he believes that the claims of reason are always going to accord with, say, the claims of the Quran or the teachings of Muhammad or whatever. But there is that sense that, in a way, you don't really need religion to understand these things if you're using your reason properly. Now, there's a large number, dozens of important medieval Islamic philosophers, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead and just focus on the two that really rise above all others. So we're going to move on to Avicenna. Avicenna, who was born around 970, died in 1037. Hugely important philosopher. You could make the claim that he is the only medieval philosopher that actually was strongly influential in the philosophy of all three Abrahamic religions, so Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Now, he was from the far eastern reaches of the Islamic Empire, what is now Uzbekistan. So he was kind of from a Persian cultural background, but he wrote most of his works in Arabic. And like a lot of the most distinguished Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages, his profession was actually medicine. Philosophy was sort of something he did on the side. He ended up writing about, and by the way, he eventually moved to what is now northern Iran. He wrote about 200 works. We have about half of them, about the other half have been lost. One of the things that's really notable about Avicenna is, and this makes him very unusual in a medieval context, not just in Islam, but just sort of in the Middle Ages in general. He actually went out of his way to be original. He didn't want to just recapitulate what previous philosophers had said or to understand them, but he wanted to sort of say something new. Now, he had a truly encyclopedic knowledge, and I mean this in a literal sense. He actually wrote multiple encyclopedias starting when he was at the age of 20. But his primary concern was metaphysics. I've already used that word. Metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that has to do with, what is reality? What are the constituents of the universe? And Aristotle was, even though he did want to be original, Aristotle was his sort of guiding light, metaphysically speaking. And what he would do is sort of take concepts and categories from Aristotle and then posit these kind of novel theories. And just to give you one example of that, he came up with an original proof of God's existence based on the Aristotelian concepts of possibility and necessity. He argued that in order for possible beings to exist, right? I'm a possible being, you're a possible being, this pencil's a possible being. What that means is, yes, in fact, we do exist, but it could be otherwise, right? We don't exist because we must exist. Okay? But for Avicenna, in order for possible beings like me or this pencil to exist, there must be a being that exists necessarily. And what he concludes is that God is precisely that necessary being. Okay? So what he's done, he's created a proof of God's existence that is based entirely on thinking through certain ideas like necessity and possibility. It's not based on observing the world or anything like that. Clearly, he has theological interests. He's interested in God, but he wants a proof of God that would be completely independent of, say, something like the Quran, right? I mean, you don't need to appeal to a sacred scripture or sacred teachers or traditions in order to prove something like the existence of God. And of course, this is not altogether unlike what somebody like Anselm was up to, or later scholastic Christian thinkers. Now, it's important to mention that in Islam, as in Christianity, as philosophy is employed more and more and enthusiastically embraced by a number of thinkers, there's going to be a negative reaction. Okay? We see this in Christianity and people like Bernard of Clairvaux and people like Peter Damian. And right around the same time, like late 11th century, early 12th century, you see that same kind of negative reaction in Islam as well. So just suffice it to say, not all Muslims really are behind Avicenna and his whole project. And as we saw with Bernard of Clairvaux, who again, incredible writer, great thinker, but wary of philosophy, you can see this in the same kind of attitude in the Islamic thinker Al-Ghazali, 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 who wrote a book whose title says it all, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. A book in which he argues that many Islamic philosophers, and especially Avicenna, end up reaching heretical conclusions precisely because they have overestimated what philosophy is able to accomplish. Okay. I mention that sort of backlash because it's going to play out in the life of the final Arabic Muslim philosopher I want to talk about, Averroes. Averroes, who lived from 1126 to 1198. Now, Avicenna, as I said, was from the far eastern reaches of the Islamic Caliphate. Well, Averroes was from the extreme western part of the Islamic world. He was from Cordoba, Spain. Now, Cordoba may be a city about which you know virtually nothing. Maybe you've never even heard of Cordoba, but I must point out that at the time of Averroes' life, Cordoba was actually the largest city in Europe. It was had about 400,000 residents and was an extremely cosmopolitan kind of place, not just ethnically speaking, but also religiously speaking. Now, again, it was part of the Islamic world. It was ruled by Muslims, but at least for a while, was ruled by Muslims who were relatively tolerant towards Jews and Christians. All right, well, Averroes, like Avicenna, was a physician by trade and also a kind of expert on Aristotle. He spent much of his career not in Spain, but across the Mediterranean Sea in Morocco, in Marrakesh, Marrakesh. But he experienced that sort of backlash against philosophy, which was seen as overly liberal by a number of Muslims in his time. And eventually, then he is exiled from Morocco. His writings were banned there, some of his books were burned. And he had to sort of live in this small village outside of Cordoba. He was eventually allowed to return to Cordoba, where he died. So he certainly could have suffered much more, but he was a victim of this suspicion of philosophy that was alive and well in certain Muslim circles. Okay, why are we talking about this guy? What are his achievements? Well, I think his most important achievement were all of his works, all 38 of them, on Aristotle. He was the premier Aristotle scholar in the Middle Ages. And I just mean in the Middle Ages, period. Whether we're talking about Muslims, Jews, or Christians, Averroes was the guy. Okay? He wrote his commentaries on Aristotle in Arabic, but they will eventually be translated into both Hebrew and Latin. His goal in writing these commentaries, other than just, shedding light on what Aristotle was talking about, was to kind of remove some of the Platonic residue that had been encrusting the works of Aristotle, and to sort of recover Aristotle's own thinking without those Platonic filters. And even though Averroes was an original thinker, he followed Aristotle on most points of metaphysics, even on those points which were highly controversial, such as the eternity of the material world. Aristotle famously believed that the world, the physical cosmos, was eternal, and Averroes accepted that view, even though that would seem to conflict with the Islamic belief in creation. So he's known for all his work on Aristotle. He did write original works as well. He wrote on a number of different topics. He wrote on medicine. He wrote on astronomy. But he did write philosophical treatises. He defended philosophy against its Islamic detractors. He wrote a work that responded to that book by Al-Ghazali. The book that Averroes wrote was called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Remember, Al-Ghazali wrote The Incoherence of the Philosopher. So this was a direct attack against Al-Ghazali. And in this work, in The Incoherence of the Incoherence, Averroes claims that human reason has the right to rationally interrogate the claims of theology. But we shouldn't worry about this. At least Muslims shouldn't worry about this, because in the end, there is no real conflict between reason and faith. Truth does not contradict truth, he says. Now, he's willing to admit that most Muslims don't really have the aptitude or the time and leisure to pursue philosophy, and they're best off just sort of accepting the teachings of the Quran. But those Muslims who do have the time and talent for philosophy have a duty to practice philosophy, which is really a kind of higher mode of thinking than just reading a sacred text and believing it. Averroes was a thinker who was very highly regarded by Christians, even by Christians who vigorously disagreed with him on a number of points. Aquinas would be one good example. Aquinas did, in fact, explicitly disagree with Averroes on a number of different issues. But for Aquinas, just like Aristotle was simply called the philosopher, Averroes was simply called by Aquinas the commentator. Right? He's the commentator on the philosopher. So he is, again, the supreme Aristotelian scholar. And this is not just some quirk of Aquinas's. If you go back to Dante and Dante's Inferno, some of you will remember reading about limbo, which is sort of technically the first circle of the inferno, but it's not very infernal, right? People are sort of basically happy or content. And he actually Dante places Averroes along with Avicenna in limbo with all the noble pagans. So that gives you some sense of how Dante regarded Averroes. Now, some Western Christian scholars went even further. There were some scholastics, typically not those who taught philosophy, but theology, but those who were in the arts faculty. Some of them were so impressed by Averroes, so convinced by his arguments, that they came to be known as the Latin Averroists. I'll just give you one name as an example, Siger of Brabant, Siger. These were Christian Latin scholars who were not just enthusiastic about all the Aristotle that they had access to, more about that in a second, but also about Averroes' own philosophy, and they were willing to follow Averroes on points that took them beyond the confines of Christian orthodoxy, points like the eternity of matter, which seems to clearly contradict the Christian teaching of creation from nothing. So that gives you some sense of just how well received Averroes was by at least some Christians in the Latin West. And I do end with Averroes, not just because of time, but because he was really the last Muslim thinker to exert a really significant influence on Christian thought. Now, in conclusion, I want to sort of close the loop here. Our story began with Christians, Syriac-speaking Christians, translating Greek texts from either Greek or Syriac into Arabic. Well, our story ends with the translation of ancient Greek texts in their Arabic translation into the Latin language. This is a process that really begins kind of at the end of the 10th century and crests around the middle of the 12th century, okay? A process by which most of the extant Greek texts from the ancient world became available in Latin because they have been translated from these Arabic translations. So most famously what happens is that eventually all the works of Aristotle become available in Latin, with the result that Aristotle actually supplants Plato, at least temporarily, as the philosopher of the Latin West. Now, there's several means by which this, or several locations where this translation happened, but Spain was arguably the most important. Spain was, in the High Middle Ages, gradually being reconquered by Christian kings. And what then happens is that Christian scholars get access to these Arabic translations. So I'll just give you one example of one particular Christian translator. The important city of Toledo in Spain was conquered by a Christian king in 1085. So it passed from Islamic rule to Christian rule. And shortly after that, a number of Christian scholars sort of go to town finding these Arabic translations of Greek texts and translating them into Latin. And I'll give you the name, just one name, Gerard of Cremona. Okay, Gerard of Cremona, who's a 12th century figure. He learned Arabic so that he could translate Arabic translations of Greek philosophy into Latin. And he ended up translating about 70-something works, including works by Aristotle. But I should also point out that Gerard not only translated ancient Greek text, but also texts written by Islamic scholars like Al-Farabi, for instance. And this brings me to my next big point, and really the last big point I want to make, which is that during this period of time, from, let's just say 1000 to 1200, that's a little sloppy, but we'll just say that for ease. It's not just forgotten Greek texts that were being rediscovered and then made available in Latin, but also Arabic commentaries on them, like Averroes's commentaries, as well as original Arabic writings in a number of different fields. Part of the appeal of Arabic culture for these Latin scholars was that not only did it supply the Greek text that they wanted, but it provided teaching resources for understanding those texts. I mean, Aristotle, if you ever read Aristotle, Aristotle is hard to understand. So it's extraordinarily helpful to have these commentaries, summaries, and other resources at hand, resources that had been created by Muslim scholars, resources that were in Arabic and needed to be translated into Latin. And without all of this work, there would simply be no Thomas Aquinas, at least no Thomas Aquinas as we know him. Thomas Aquinas probably never read Aristotle without Averroes's commentaries right by his side. Okay, so this whole story that we've been tracking, the rise of the university, the rediscovery of Aristotle, all of that, all of those developments that made people like Thomas Aquinas or Bonaventure possible, this is a story that is intertwined with the story of Islamic philosophy in the Middle Ages. And I'll stop there.